A mountain in October. Rain falling sideways across old pine and rusted iron rails, half buried in years of needles and moss. A young woman crosses a timber trestle bridge over a gorge 60 feet above white water, one careful foot at a time, no railing, nothing between her and the drop but intention. She stops, looks down. Under the last section of bridge bolted to the trestle structure, a hatch, wooden, hinged, fitted with an iron ring pull, not accidental, deliberate. She should keep moving. She does not keep moving. She wraps her hands around the ring and pulls. The hatch opens smoothly, the way things open when someone has been maintaining them for years. Below 12 feet down, a faint amber glow rises from the dark, warm, steady, not empty. Someone built this for a woman who did not yet exist. She carefully swings her legs over the edge. The note was 6 words. Your services are no longer needed. That was all, handwritten on the back of a receipt, tucked under the register where she would find it when she came in for her Wednesday shift. 6 words and not one more. The diner manager had not even stayed to watch her read it, which told her something, which told her he had done this before, to someone, to enough someones that he had figured out it was easier not to be there. She stood in the empty diner and read the note twice. She did not cry. She had stopped doing that at 14 when she figured out that crying in a group home was a form of advertisement. You cried and people noticed, and the noticing was never the kind that helped. She folded the note, put it in her jacket pocket, walked out the back door, did not take anything from the kitchen, even though the jar of peanut butter on the second shelf was more than half full and would not be missed. She walked to the room she rented by the week. She already knew before she touched the key. The lock was wrong, not broken, changed. She pressed her key against it twice the way you did when you were being reasonable, when you were giving the situation the benefit of the doubt it did not deserve. The second time, the key did not fit any better than the first. She stood on the landing for a moment. There were $43 in the room, 3 days of tips she had not deposited yet. A wool sweater she had bought at a thrift store in November, a road atlas she had carried for 2 years. The atlas mattered, the sweater mattered, the $43 mattered the most. She knocked, nothing. She knocked again, because she was a reasonable person and reasonable people knocked twice. The landlord's car was gone from the lot, so that was that. She went to the sheriff's office, because that was what you did, because she had done it before, and it had not helped before, and she was going again anyway, hoping, which was a thing she was still doing despite the evidence. The deputy was a man in his 40s who had the expression of someone who made a deliberate decision at the start of each shift about how much he would care. She watched him listen. She watched him decide. Before she finished explaining, he had already landed somewhere, and she could see exactly where. He said some things about ordinances. He said some things about tenant protections and what the timeline was and what her options were. He said these things the way you said things to someone you had already decided would not be following up. Then he said something about her, about a girl with no local ties and no permanent address, about the kind of situation that was more complicated than the town had resources to manage. She left before he finished, because the door was closing and she had learned to move before it closed all the way. Her pack was in a locker at the bus station, 30 pounds, one change of clothes inside a plastic bag, a wool blanket, a box of crackers about a third full, a jar of peanut butter she had bought with her own money, a folding knife, the road atlas, a stub of pencil, and a small spiral notebook she used to write down anything that seemed worth remembering. She had been hoarding the last 8 pages for something, and $12, $11, and some coins, actually. She counted it standing next to the locker. 4 dimes and a nickel and 6 pennies, $11.61. The kind of money that was not nothing, but also not enough for anything you could name. She had been 20 for 3 months. She walked north, not because north was better, because north was uphill, because uphill was away from the town, and away was the only direction with any promise in it right now. The left boot was giving her trouble. The sole had started to separate at the toe 3 weeks ago. She had re-glued it with hardware store cement, and it had held for 2 weeks, and now it was starting again. The particular feeling of the sole thinking about leaving, reconsidering its commitment, which she recognized because she had been in enough situations that were also reconsidering their commitment to her. The road went from pavement to gravel to a service track that ended at a rusted iron gate. Beyond the gate, running straight up through second growth pine, were the tracks, 2 rails, furred with orange rust, half buried in pine needles, not dead exactly, just extremely tired. She climbed over the gate. The grade was steeper than it looked from below. Her calves knew this immediately and filed a formal objection. The ties were rotten and stretches punky, underfoot saw, so she walked the center between the rails where the roadbed was packed solid. Someone had built this to carry weight. The mountain had been working on reclaiming it for years. The mountain was winning but had not won yet. The rain came in sideways once she cleared the tree line. She ate 2 crackers and did not stop to do it. An hour up, the trees pulled back and the gorge opened on her right without warning, 60 feet straight down to white water. The sound of it was serious, not decorative mountain sound, real water doing real work on real rock. She had to lean against the grade to keep her balance when the wind hit her at the lip. Spanning the gorge was a timber trestle bridge, old, the kind of old that had stopped being a description and started being a condition. The timber was dark with mountain weather gray-brown and dense, braced and crossed in patterns she did not know the engineering names for, but understood instinctively as right, as built by someone who understood what force meant, who understood what held. It had no railing, just the ties and the rails and 60 feet of air on both sides. She stood at the approach and looked at it, not because she was afraid, because she was tired and the crossing was not a crossing she could do at half attention. She needed to be awake for it. She crossed, 1 foot, then the other, eyes on the far side, weight centered. The rain had made the woods slick and she walked the way you walked on ice, which was slowly, which was the only speed ice or rain-soaked timber allowed. Halfway across, the wind lifted, and she moved with it instead of against it. Better, faster. She was in the center of the span when she looked down for 1 second, just to check, which was when she saw it. Under the last section of bridge, set into a frame of weathered planks, bolted directly to the trestle structure in a way that looked deliberate and engineered and absolutely out of place. A hatch, wooden, hinged, fitted with an iron ring pull. She stopped. She looked at it. She looked at it again, the way you looked at something a second time to make sure the first time was real, not accidental, not a maintenance access point built by the rail company. The planking was a different age than the trestle itself, older in a different way, added by someone who was not the original builders and who had thought carefully about what they were doing. She stayed where she was for a moment. A reasonable person kept walking. A reasonable person crossed the bridge and continued up the mountain and found a town or a road or another human being with a phone and explain the situation in a way that might lead to temporary assistance. A reasonable person did not kneel down on a rain-slicked bridge over a 60-foot gorge and reach for an iron ring. The iron ring was cold and slick with rain. She wrapped both hands around it and pulled. The hatch opened smoothly, not stuck, not swollen, not seized by decades of weather. Smooth, hinged on one side with a precision that had no right to still be functioning this well. The wood was dense and dark with age, but solid, sealed along the edges with something rubberized that had kept most of the moisture out. Someone had not just built this, someone had maintained it. Below the hatch, a ladder, iron rungs set into a wooden shaft, dropping 12 feet into a darkness that was not quite dark. A faint amber glow rose from below, warm, steady. She did not think about it very long. She swung her legs over the edge and climbed down. The shaft was tight. Her pack caught once and she angled herself and it released. She pulled the hatch shut above her as she went, half instinct and half the feeling that leaving it open was leaving a door unlocked in a neighborhood she did not know. The rain disappeared. Sound disappeared. The deep, insulated quiet of the mountain replaced everything. By the time her boots touched the floor, she could feel the temperature change in her face. Warm, genuinely warm. Not the warmth of a building with a furnace somewhere behind the walls, the warmth of the earth itself, which had been holding it since long before she was born and intended to keep holding it indefinitely. She stood still and let her body calibrate. The room was not small. She had expected small. She had expected the kind of cramped maintenance space that made sense beneath a railroad bridge. What she got was a room, a real room, 30 feet of it in one direction and 20 feet in the other, and a ceiling high enough to stand fully upright, which she did immediately because she had been bent against the rain for an hour and her back had opinions. Timber walls, heavy planks fitted close and chinked with something that had dried gray and hard. The ceiling the same. The floor was wood sealed with something dark, the planks thick and steady underfoot, without the creak she expected. Along the south wall, a long built-in shelf, sealed tin canisters in a row, a glass oil lamp reservoir, half-full wick trimmed, short and centered, the way a careful person trimmed a wick. The lamp was lit, the amber glow. She crossed to it and held her palm near the glass chimney without touching it. Warm, real warmth from a burning flame. This lamp had been lit recently, hours ago, today. She stepped back and held that information carefully, turned in a slow circle, caught frame against the east wall slats intact, small iron stove against the north wall, pipe vanishing through the ceiling. Beside the stove, a stack of split wood, dry, recent enough that it still smelled of fresh-cut pine, and on the stove a small iron pot. She did not touch it immediately. She stood in the middle of the room and understood this was not abandoned. This was not a ruin or a time capsule. This was a place someone had been this morning. Who? She looked at the hatch above her 12 feet up through the shaft. Closed, silent. She heard nothing through it. No footsteps on the bridge above, no engine, no rain, even though the rain was certainly still happening. She looked at the pot. She lifted the lid. Beans, dried herbs, cooked slowly enough that the liquid had thickened to something substantial. The pot was warm in the way things were warm when someone had set them to simmer and then walked out for an errand. She put the lid back. Not her beans. She would figure out whose beans later. She moved through the room systematically. She was good at assessing spaces quickly. Foster care taught you that. New place every few months for 4 years taught you to read a room in under 2 minutes. What was shared, what was off limits, where the exits were, who held authority over what. The shelves along the south wall held more than the canisters and lamp. Behind them, push-back crocks sealed with wax, a coil of copper wire, folded canvas, what looked like seed packets wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. She found the floor hatch in the southeast corner, pressed the board and felt it give on a pivot point. Below, another depth, cold air coming up through it. She held the lamp down through the opening and saw shelves lining the walls, more crocks, sand-packed vegetables, dried things she could not identify at this distance. A root cellar, under the main room, under the bridge. She let the floor panel close and kept moving. The cold storage was through a doorway in the east wall that she had initially read as solid. Not a door, just a fitted panel, the same planking as the wall. She found the latch at shoulder height, a wooden pin, and pressed it up. The panel swung. The cold storage passage was long, 60 feet at least. The ceiling dropped here and the air temperature dropped with it 10 degrees colder than the main room. She walked the length of it slowly, holding the lamp along both walls. 3 zones separated by shelves built to different heights. Root vegetables and sand. At the far end, wire drying frames. In the middle section, still holding the remnants of dried herbs. Sealed crocks along the north wall, where the stone showed through the timber. This was not a weekend project. This was not something a person threw together in a summer. This was years of work, decades. She went back to the main room. In the back wall behind the cot, another fitted panel, another latch. This door led into a stone passage, earthen floor sloping upward, not toward the bridge, away from it, into the mountain. She took the lamp and went up. The passage was timber-shored, at intervals old-growth posts, set into the earth crossbeams, notched above. In 2 places, the timber had shifted with settling, and she had to move around where a post leaned inward. She pressed her hand to one of them. Solid. It looked worse than it was. The air changed as she climbed. Damp stone, pine resin, the mountain breathing against her face from somewhere ahead. The tunnel ended at a wooden door, low, 5 feet. She had to angle to get through. What she stepped into was not another chamber. She stopped, stood there for a full 10 seconds. Above her, a natural granite dome, the shape of a bowl turned upside down, the rock curving in a perfect arc 25 feet overhead. But the dome was not dark. 18 panels of glass had been set into the granite at calculated angles, each panel seated into a prepared kerf in the rock with what looked like lead flashing, sealed with something that had held for decades. The glass was old, thick, wavy surface in the way glass was made before the process was standardized, but the light coming through it was real. Gray October light filtered through old glass and struck the dome's interior and bounced and scattered and filled the space with a diffuse glow that was nothing like the lamp she carried and nothing like daylight and something entirely its own. The floor of the dome was soil, deep-worked, amended soil. She could see the difference from the natural rock by the color and the texture. Someone had brought soil into this space, or built the space around existing soil. She was not sure which would have been harder. Along the east and south arc of the dome, growing things. Herbs, a lot of them, many, she could name and some she could not, growing in wooden planting frames set along the stone wall. Root vegetables in beds along the floor, their leaves still green. And at the center of the space, planted directly in the dome floor, a tree, an apple tree, small, maybe 8 feet, but established, roots set. The trunk had the character of a tree that had been growing in this spot for years, and on its highest branches, a few late apples still clung, small and dark red, too sheltered from the mountain wind to have fallen, holding on in the diffuse glow of salvaged glass, the way fruit held on when it did not know the season was ending. She stood in the light coming through 18 panels of glass and looked at those apples and felt something move in her chest that was not a feeling she had a name for, not joy exactly, not disbelief exactly, something that was both of those things and also something else, something older. She stayed in the dome for a long time, then she went back down. In the main room, she looked at the shelves again with different attention, the books she had noticed earlier, not a large collection, maybe 30-odd volumes on the lowest shelf of the south wall, sitting in a gap between the canisters and a stack of flat wooden boxes. She had assumed they were reference books, field guides, the kind of thing you kept in a functional space. She crossed to the shelf and held the lamp up. Not reference books, journals, all of them, different sizes, different cloth bindings, different ages, lined up on the shelf from left to right, and as she tilted the nearest one to read the date on the first page, she saw the arrangement was not random. They were in order, the oldest on the left, the newest on the right. She counted them, 31 journals, running from something in the early 1940s to a volume that still looked recent enough to read, 31 different handwritings. She understood then what this shelf was. 31 people had found this place, not one, not two, not the builder and one successor. 31 people had found the hatch and climbed down the ladder and stayed long enough to write something down in a notebook they left behind. She stood in front of the shelf and felt the scale of it, the way you felt something that was too large to absorb all at once, like standing at the edge of the gorge and knowing 60 feet was real, but not being able to feel it until you actually looked down. 31 voices. All of them had been here. All of them had seen the lamp. All of them had felt the warmth. All of them had stayed long enough to add a line to a shelf that was growing slowly across decades, like a record of something the world outside would never know about. She took the oldest journal from the left end of the shelf, dark cloth gone soft with age, no name on the cover. She opened it to the first page, carefully afraid of tearing paper that had outlasted everything it should have. The handwriting was small, precise, the kind of precision that came from drafting from practice, from a body that had been trained to make accurate marks. The first line gave a number, 4190. Below that, a single word, ridge. Below that, a date, 1938, not 1941, not something recent, 1938. She had been born 62 years after this page was written. She turned to the second page. The entry was brief, economical, the way someone wrote when they were recording facts, not performing. I came here the same way I come to any site. I walked it first. I measured it. I thought about load and drainage and air circulation and the weight of what I intended to build. Then I started. She read it again. Load and drainage and air circulation, the weight of what I intended to build. This was not the journal of someone who had stumbled onto this place like she had. This was the journal of the person who built it. She turned to the third page. My name is Clem Cade. I am a structural engineer, though I have spent the last 7 years doing this work under a different name because no firm will hire a woman to do what I do. I do it anyway. I build under my employer's signature, and I build correctly, and I have learned not to need credit for this. What I need credit cannot give me. I need this place. She stopped reading. She read those last four words again. I need this place. Not I found this place. Not I claim this place. Not I built this place for myself. I need this place. The difference between those things was everything. She could feel the difference the way you felt, temperature. The builder of this dome, of these chambers, of the cold storage passage, and the root cellar, and the 18 panels of glass set into granite overhead, the builder was a woman who had spent 7 years working under someone else's name, who had walked this ridge the way she walked any site, who had measured and thought and started. Clem Cade, structural engineer, unnamed in every building she had ever built, who had come here and built something that would last under her own name. She sat on the cot with the lamp beside her and the journal in both hands and read. Clem's entries were dated only by season, not by month or day. She had stopped measuring time by calendar, the way you stopped measuring distance and steps once you were moving through a project. Time became material. Time became what the stone allowed and what the frost permitted and what the load calculations required. The first 3 seasons were excavation, alone, with tools she had listed in the margins, cold chisels, a hand drill, salvaged timber from a rail trestle repair she had quietly arranged to be assigned to, iron brackets ordered through a hardware supplier, 2 counties over listed in the ledger as agricultural fencing hardware, everything accounted for, everything deniable. She had found the granite dome by accident in the second summer, had pulled back a section of loose shale on the upper slope looking for drainage lines, and found instead a natural cavity in the rock domed, sealed on top by a shelf of granite that had formed a perfect ceiling. She had written about it in a single paragraph that was the most restrained piece of writing in the journal. Found the upper chamber today. I had not anticipated it, and I was not prepared for it. I sat inside for an hour. I think this is why I am here. That was all. Below it, 1 line, I think this is where the light goes. She set the journal down on her knee and looked at the ceiling above her. Timber, earth, and somewhere up through that passage, 18 panels of glass in a granite dome, letting in the gray October afternoon. She picked the journal back up. She read until the lamp began to show the flicker that meant the reservoir was getting low. She did not read all of it. There was too much, but she read enough to understand the shape of what Clem Cade had built and why and when and how long it had taken. 16 years, from 1938 to 1954, 16 years of coming to this mountain in the seasons when the work allowed, building downward first, then upward, the main chamber and the cold storage and the root cellar below, then the stone passage and the dome, then the glass panels, which had been the hardest thing. She had written about sourcing 18 panels of old glass from a demolished factory 2 states over, transporting them, wrapped in canvas, in the bed of a truck she borrowed under a pretext she did not name. Installing each one in prepared slots, she had chiseled into the granite, a process she spent 3 winters, completing 1 panel at a time. She had not built it alone exactly. She had built it without help, which was different. Alone implied no resources. She had resources. She had training that had taken 15 years to acquire. She had access to materials through her professional work. She had the problem-solving capacity of someone who had designed load-bearing structures under conditions that would have been difficult even with a team. What she had not had was anyone to help carry the stone, so she carried it herself. The entry for the final year was different from the rest, shorter, more compressed, as if by 1954 the writing was not for recording facts, but for completing something. The dome produces food now in all 4 seasons, with attention to the glass angles and the planting calendar I've developed. The root cellar has held through 3 hard winters without loss. The cold storage passage maintains the temperature differential I calculated. Everything I design works as I intended. Below that, I am not sure I will come back after this season. My reasons are my own, but I want whoever comes next to know the cellar key is under the stone at the base of the eastern shelf. The glass panels need checking after hard winters. The soil in the dome needs amendment in spring with material from the compost frame on the north bench. And then on the last page that held writing, "If you are here, you found the hatch by accident. You were crossing the bridge and you looked down at the right moment and something made you reach for the ring. That is how I found the fissure in the granite. I was looking for drainage and I found something I had not planned for. Some things cannot be planned. They can only be found. I built this for women who had nothing. If you are one, everything here is yours. The journals on the shelf tell you who came before you. You will add one of your own. That is the only record this place keeps." She read those last lines again. "I built this for women who had nothing." She looked down at herself. $12.61. A damp jacket. A boot whose left sole was beginning its 3rd attempt at separation. The crackers in her pack. The peanut butter. The road atlas she had been carrying for 2 years without knowing exactly where she was going. Nothing. She definitely qualified. She set the journal back on the shelf with a care that was the most careful thing she had done all day. She rebuilt the stove from the dry stack. She ate a portion of the beans, not all of them, half, because whoever had made them had not made them for her, and she would figure out whose they were before she decided what that meant. She lay down on the cot with the wool blanket she found folded on the shelf above it and listened to the quiet of a space built to hold silence, a space where 31 people before her had heard the same nothing she was hearing now. She did not sleep immediately. She thought about Clem Cade. She thought about what it meant to spend 16 years building something under your own name when your professional life had required you to build everything under someone else's. She thought about the apple tree in the dome, the small late fruit holding on in October, when everything else on the mountain had already let go. She thought about the word need, not found, not claimed, not built. Need. She had been in a lot of places that did not need her. She had walked through a lot of doors that closed behind her without losing anything. She had been a presence that left no trace because the places she inhabited were not built to hold her. This one was different. She could feel it the way you felt temperature. She put her hand flat against the timber wall and felt nothing from outside. No rain, no wind, no vibration from the bridge above. The mountain held it all. The mountain had been holding everything for a long time. She fell asleep. Outside, through the glass panels in the granite dome, one passage above her, the October sky was going dark. The apple tree stood in the half-light of evening, filtered through old glass. The few late apples still on the highest branches were small and dark and patient, the color of garnets catching the last angle of gray light, as if they had known it was coming and had stayed specifically for this. She woke up before the light change, which was how she always woke, before the alarm when there was an alarm, before the shift bell when there was a shift, before the house parent did rounds, when she was young enough that there was a house parent doing rounds. Her body had developed opinions about being caught off guard, and those opinions were very strong. The lamp had burned low, but not out. The stove had held warmth through the night the way a well-sized stove held warmth when the iron was right for the space. She lay still for a moment and listened to the silence that was not empty but full of the mountain's own slow respiration, the fissure somewhere behind the wall, the almost sound of deep earth being itself. She got up. She rebuilt the stove from the dry stack. She found the tin of tea on the shelf, old but functional, and made some in the same mug she had used the night before. She drank it standing, looking at the journals on the shelf, all 31 of them. She had read Clemcade's journal until the lamp flickered. She had not read the others. She would read them, but not yet. First, she wanted to see the rest. She went back to the southeast corner and opened the root cellar hatch. This time, she took the ladder down properly instead of just holding the lamp through the opening. The root cellar was deeper than she had understood from above, 40 feet at least. The shelves ran 3 walls, and the temperature was engineered, not accidental. 2 drainage channels in the floor moved air from a fissure at the bottom toward a vent she could not see. The crocks on the shelves were labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize from Clem's. Newer, beets, carrots, dried apple, dried pear, pickled something in large, sealed jars along the lowest shelf. Not Clem's handwriting, someone else's, one of the 31. She climbed back up. She went through the cold storage passage and up the stone tunnel and through the low door into the dome. In daylight, the dome was different again. The light coming through the 18 panels was harder now, the October sun at a low angle that sent shafts through the glass at steep degrees, catching the dust in the air and making visible things you would have missed in diffuse light. The apple tree stood in the center shaft and threw a shadow on the dome floor that moved slowly across the stone as the morning progressed. She watched it for a minute. The movement was so slow it should not have been perceptible, but it was. The way you could see the minute hand of a clock move if you stared long enough. Time made visible. In the dome, she took stock of what was growing with the attention of someone who had worked one season in an orchard and knew the difference between what was decorative and what was producing. The herbs in the wooden frames were mostly in second growth, cut back recently and regrowing from the roots. Thyme, sage, oregano, several she could not name by sight, but recognized by smell. The root beds held beets and turnips and parsnips, their leaves still healthy. The apple tree had put on some new growth at the tips of the south-facing branches, tight green leaf buds forming weeks ahead of any outdoor tree she had seen at this elevation. The dome ran on its own calendar. Clem had made sure of that. She found the door on the north side of the dome that led upward, not through a tunnel this time, up a stone ramp that had been chipped into the granite shallow treads, steep but manageable. It brought her out through a narrow fissure in the rock face that was screened from outside view by a stand of pine growing close against the cliff. She emerged onto the mountain, and she stopped, because the view from here was not what she expected. Below her, the ridge fell away in a series of terraced shelves, 3 of them, set into the natural topography of the slope at elevations that caught maximum southern sun. Each terrace may be 50 feet wide and twice as long, and on each terrace trees, not 11 trees, not the modest, productive orchard the journals had suggested. Trees. She counted as far as she could see and stopped counting at 70 because the upper terrace curved behind a rock outcrop and she could not see what was on the far side, but she could see enough. Apple varieties she could identify from the leaf shape and the growth pattern. Pear trees along the cliff-facing edge where the drainage was different, what looked like 3 or 4 quince trees At the far end of the lowest bench, berry canes in rows along the slope between the terraces. A gravity-fed water system moved between the benches, the main line set into the stone above the upper terrace and dividing into 3 distributaries that ran along the head of each bench in channels carved from the rock, fitted with small adjustable gates made from iron that had gone the dark color of old rust but still functioned. She pressed one of the gates and felt it move in its channel, still working, still doing the thing it was built to do. She stood on the upper bench and looked down the slope and tried to understand what one person had built here over 16 years. What kind of mind had looked at this ridge and seen not a mountain but a system, not obstacles but conditions, not limitations but variables to be solved. She worked the benches for 2 hours. She was not sure why she started. She just found herself moving along the lower terrace with a purpose she had not consciously decided on, clearing fallen debris from the irrigation channels, pressing the bark of the trees the way she had learned to press bark, checking for the wrong kind of give. Most of the trees were healthy. A few needed attention she could not give today. She noted them the way she noted things she intended to come back to. By mid-morning, she was back in the main chamber, eating crackers and peanut butter and reading the second journal from the left end of the shelf. This one was from 1943. The handwriting was large and slightly erratic, the writing of someone not accustomed to writing frequently, but doing it anyway because they needed somewhere for the words to go. She had thought Clem's handwriting was a man's hand and been wrong, so she held the assumption loosely this time. The writer had found the hatch the same way she had, looking down from the bridge in February, in snow half frozen. They had stayed 11 days. They had left because they had to. The last page said, "I don't know who made this or why. I don't know how I will explain to myself that this exists and I left it, but I left it better than I found it. That's what the place seems to ask. So that's what I did." She set that journal down and picked up one from the middle of the row. A woman this time, the handwriting unmistakable, small, and left-leaning. She had stayed through an entire winter, 7 months. She had planted the berry canes on the slope between the terraces. She had added a second planting frame in the dome. She had started the compost system that Clem had referenced in her own journal as something that needed establishing. On the last page she had written, "Whoever comes next, the compost needs turning every 3 weeks. I know that sounds small, but small things done consistently are what keep everything alive." She read 4 more journals before she heard the sound above her. Footsteps on the bridge. She set the journal down and did not move. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, not running, not stopping. The footsteps of someone who crossed this bridge regularly and had made peace with the fact that it had no railing. She watched the hatch. The hatch opened. She said, "I'm not armed." A pause. A man's voice, not young, "Neither am I." He came down the ladder. She watched his feet first, then his legs, then the rest of him. Canvas jacket, worn jeans, work boots that had been waterproofed recently, a canvas bag over one shoulder. He reached the bottom and turned. He was maybe 55, not tall. His face had the texture of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, weathered in a way that made his age hard to pin. He had a scar on the back of his right hand, wide and flat, the kind that came from a burn or a sudden shearing force. His eyes went to the lamp first, then to her, then to the pot on the stove. He said, "How long have you been here?" She said, "1 night." He said, "Did you read the journals?" She said, "Most of the founding one." He said, "That's how it starts." He set his bag on the floor, did not sit down yet. He was reading the room the way she had read it, when she first came in, finding his bearings, except his bearings were off because the room had changed since the last time he was in it, because she was in it. She said, "You lit the lamp." He said, "I light it once a month. Come down, light it, leave food on the stove, go back up." She said, "You don't stay." He said, "I don't go past this room." He looked at the door to the cold storage, then at the stone passage door behind her. "I've never gone past the first room." She said, "Why?" He said it felt like it wasn't mine to go further into. He said it simply, not an excuse, a fact. He sat down on the wooden box against the south wall, the way someone sat when they had been carrying something heavy and had just decided they could put it down. She said, "How did you find the hatch?" He said, "Same way you did, I assume, looking down from the wrong spot at the right moment." She said, 8 years ago." He looked at her. She said, "The last journal on the shelf is from 2019. The handwriting is different from the others, like someone who hadn't written by hand in a long time. But the name you gave yourself was just initials." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "CV." She said, "Corbin Veer." He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. He said, "Structural engineer, before." She said, "Before what?" He said, "Before a building I designed came down during construction." He said it the way you said facts that were finished. Nobody died. It wasn't a collapse during use. It was a construction fault in a retaining wall, and the wall failed, and 4 workers were injured, and none of it should have happened, and all of it was my fault. He set his hands on his knees. He said I was very good at what I did. He said it without pride, the way you said a thing that was just true, and then I was wrong about something I should not have been wrong about. And the distance between those two things was impossible to cross, so I didn't cross it. I just left. She said, "And came here." He said, "Eventually. There were other places first. None of them held." She understood that. The not holding. The way some spaces just let you flow through them without catching. She said, "You've been here 8 years and you never went past the first room." He said, "I light the lamp. I leave food. I go back up." He paused. "It's enough contact." She said, "Contact with what?" He said, "With the fact that it exists." She held that. He said, "When you've spent years building things that failed, there's something about being near something that worked, even if you didn't build it, even if you don't go inside it." He looked at the stone walls. Clem Cade built this in 1938, and it's still here. Every joint, every lintel, every calculation she made is still doing what she intended. She said, "You know about Clem Cade." He said, "I know what the county records say." He reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a folder, worn at the edges, well handled. The folder of someone who had been working with its contents for a long time. He opened it on his knee. "I've spent 8 years looking into the history of this ridge. I couldn't go inside the place, but I could learn everything about who built it." She got up and crossed to him and looked at the folder. Papers, county survey maps, photocopied records, some of them barely legible, a handwritten list of dates and names, newspaper clippings from local papers, the kind printed in small towns that still had archives. He said Clem Cade was a licensed structural engineer in 1931. She was one of 9 women in the entire state to hold an engineering license at that time. She worked for a firm called Arco Drafting and Design for 18 years, listed as a technical drafter, because no client would have hired a firm that acknowledged a woman as their structural engineer. After Arco, she worked independently for 5 more years, 23 years in total doing other people's engineering under other people's names. She said she was doing all the engineering. He said all of it, according to a letter I found in the State Engineering Archive written by her employer after her disappearance. He had a lot to say once she was gone, and there was no longer a professional reason to stay quiet. She said she disappeared in 1954. He said she filed a voluntary missing declaration in October 1954, signed and notarized. It said she was of sound mind and was removing herself from contact with the public record by her own choice and asked that no search be conducted. The sheriff at the time accepted it. He filed it and closed the inquiry. She said, "Why did she leave?" He said, "I don't know." He looked at the papers. She was 51 in 1954. She had been doing other people's work under other people's names for 23 years. He paused. "I have theories, but I don't know." He was quiet. Then he said, "What I do know is that in 1953, 1 year before she disappeared, she filed a legal document with the county, a trust document, registered formally. I found a reference to it in a secondary record, a note made in the margin of a land survey from 1961 that mentioned a prior trust filing on the ridge. But I could not find the actual document." She said, "Why not?" He said, "The county records from 1945 through 1960 were partially destroyed in a flood in 1967. The original filing was in that range. The county has no copy." She said, "So the document exists, but there's no record of it." He said, "There's a reference to it and nothing else." He closed the folder, which means whatever it said, whatever it established, it's effectively invisible. Unless, she said it before she finished thinking it, unless the original copy still exists somewhere else. He looked at her. She looked at the walls. She said she built something that worked. Every joint, every lintel, every calculation. She said, "You think she'd file the most important document she ever wrote and only keep one copy in a county office?" He was quiet. She said, "No, she kept a copy." She stood up. She said she was a structural engineer. She built things to outlast herself. He said, "If there's a copy, where would she have put it?" She thought about the founding journal, the way it had been written, economical, precise, the way you wrote when you were recording facts without redundancy, the way every element of the compound had a purpose and every purpose had a backup. She thought about what the journal had said at the end. "I want whoever comes next to know," and then specific instructions for maintenance, for the glass, for the soil. She said the journal ends with her saying, "The place is for women who had nothing," and then it ends. But she wrote something in the journal about cornerstones. Every significant structure has a cornerstone, she wrote, not ceremonial, a real cornerstone with actual function, because a building without an anchor is just materials hoping to stay vertical. He said, "You read enough of the journal to know that." She said, "I read fast." He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking there's another message, not in the journal, somewhere in the structure itself." She went back to the dome. He followed. She heard him stop at the top of the stone ramp when the dome opened above him, the pause of someone encountering it for the first time. She did not stop for him. She was already moving along the east wall of the dome, running her hand along the granite, not looking at the glass panels or the apple tree or the growing frames, looking at the stone. Clem had worked this wall. The chisel marks were deliberate along the section where the glass panels were seated, systematic, the marks of an engineer working with intention. But there was another section of the east wall lower, below the panels, where the chiseling was different, the same precision but a different purpose, not fitting glass, fitting something else. She crouched. She ran her fingers along the lower wall at knee height. The October afternoon light was hitting the dome at an angle that struck the east face in a way that would not have been visible in the morning. Low, raking, the kind of light that made surface texture visible that flat light erased. She saw the seam, a rectangle, roughly 6 inches by 4, cut into the granite with a patience that was almost indistinguishable from the natural variation of the rock face. Almost, but the corners were too right-angled, the depth too consistent. The edges had the mark of a narrow-bladed tool used with control. She pressed the center of the rectangle and felt it give slightly. Not a hinge, a friction fit, designed to hold against casual pressure, but yield to deliberate pressure at the right point. She pressed harder. The stone piece moved inward, then tilted. Then she was able to get her fingers around the edge and draw it out. Behind it, a cavity in the rock, maybe 8 inches deep, wide enough for what was inside. A tin capsule, cylindrical, the kind used for waterproofing important papers in situations where you could not guarantee the environment. Old-fashioned but entirely functional. The lid had been sealed with wax that had yellowed and cracked at the edges with age but held. She looked at it for a long moment. He said from the top of the ramp, "What did you find?" She said, "I'm not sure yet." She carried it to the growing light coming through the south panels and turned it over in her hands. The exterior surface had writing, scratched into the metal itself with something sharp. She tilted it until the angle was right. It said, "For the woman who has gone all the way in." She ran her thumb across the words. All the way in. She had gone all the way in. She opened the wax seal with the blade of her folding knife working carefully at the edge without forcing it. The wax came away in pieces. The lid turned with a slight resistance and then released. Inside a single folded sheet of paper, heavy paper built for longevity. It had been folded and sealed with a second wax bead inside the capsule. She broke that seal and unfolded it. The handwriting was Clem's, smaller than the journal entries compressed, as if she were fitting everything necessary into as little space as possible. She read, "This is for the woman who has seen all 5 spaces, who has gone to the dome and found the east wall and opened this. I finished fitting the dome in 1947 and built this cavity at the same time and sealed it in 1953 when I had the thing to put in it. If you are reading this, you are determined. I said that in the journal. I meant it. Here is what I need you to know. In 1953, I established a legal trust with the county of this ridge. It protects this land. It specifies who may use it and for what purpose and on what terms. The county copy of that document no longer exists. I learned in 1960 from a friend in the records office that the flood had taken it. By then, I was already gone, and it did not matter in the way it once had. But I kept a copy. A copy of that document is inside the northeast cornerstone of the main chamber, 3rd course of stone from the floor, the stone that is slightly lighter in color than those around it. You will need to remove it carefully. The document is wrapped in oilskin and will be intact. You are the reason I put it there, not you specifically. I did not know you, but I knew you would come. I always knew someone would come. Read the document. Understand what it establishes. The land is protected. What happens next is up to you. You went all the way in. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." She folded the paper. She held it in both hands and looked at the apple tree in the center of the dome. The small late fruit on the high branches caught the afternoon light, dark red and patient, holding on past what the season required, not performing, not decorating, just doing what they were doing in the conditions they had been given. He said from the ramp, "What does it say?" She said, "There's a document hidden in the main chamber, a cornerstone." He said, "What kind of document?" She said, "I think the kind that explains why you couldn't find the trust in the county records." She stood up. She carried the tin capsule and the folded paper back down through the stone passage through the cold storage into the main room. She stood in the center of it and looked at the northeast wall, stone in the lower section. She had assumed this was just the mountain showing through, but it was not natural. She crouched and ran her hand along the third course of stone from the floor. The color difference was small, but it was there. One stone slightly paler than the granite around it, seated into the wall at a point that looked like every other stone until you were looking for the wrong shade. She pressed it and felt the difference. He came to stand beside her. She could hear his breathing change from when he was cautious in the doorway to now when he was something else, present. The way an engineer stood near a structure he needed to understand. She said, "I need something to help lever this." He reached into his canvas bag and took out a folding pry bar, the kind a careful person carried in rough country. She said, "Of course you have that." He said, 8 years of maintaining a mountain." She fitted the bar into the seam at the stone's lower edge. She worked it carefully, not forcing, not rushing, feeling for the give that said the mortar was releasing without cracking. The stone shifted, then it came. She set it on the floor. Behind it, a cavity in the wall, deeper than she expected, lined with old wood to protect the contents from the damp. Inside, wrapped in dark oilskin, tied with twine that had gone stiff with decades of mountain air, a document. She untied the twine, unwrapped the oilskin. The paper inside was heavy, the kind Clem preferred for things she intended to outlast her. She unfolded it, multiple pages fastened together with a brass clip that had tarnished to near black. The top page bore the heading of a legal form. The county named the year 1953, a notary seal that had impressed itself into the paper with enough force that it was still legible. At the top, the title, 4 words, Ridge Trust for Women. She read the first paragraph, and the second, and the third. She read slowly because the language was precise, and she wanted to be sure she was reading what it actually said and not what she wanted it to say. He said, "What does it say?" She said, "It says she established a legal trust in 1953 for the purpose of holding this land in perpetuity for the benefit of women who come to it in need." He said, "And the copy is valid without the county registration." She said, "I don't know. I'm not a lawyer." She paused. She said, "But she built things to outlast herself, and this has." She looked at the document in her hands, the weight of the paper, the age of it, the fact that it had spent 70 years behind a stone in a wall inside a mountain and had come out whole. He said nothing, but he was nodding. Outside, through the main chamber's ventilation seam, the October light was going amber, going long, filling the space with the gold of a season that knew it was ending and had decided to be beautiful about it. She set the document on the cot. She sat beside it. She was 20 years old. She had $11.61. She had a boot whose left sole was attempting to resign. She had not had a permanent address in 2 years, and she had lived in enough places that did not want her to understand what wanting felt like by its absence. Clem Cade had built this for women who had nothing. She definitely qualified. She read the trust document twice, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, because she needed to be sure that what she understood was what it actually said. The first page established the parties. Clem Cade, registered engineer county of record, the county itself as witness and repository of the filing. The date September 1953. The second page established the property, a legal description of the ridge in chains and links and compass bearings, the way land was described in 1953. The acreage included the 3 terrace benches, the cliff faced the area of the bridge and the gorge, and a buffer zone extending 200 feet in every direction from the boundary of the terraces. She said, "The buffer zone." He said, "What about it?" She showed him the description. He read it, was quiet. He said, "My cabin is inside the buffer." She said, "How far inside?" He said, 40, 50 feet. She said, "So it's part of the trust protection." He said, "If the trust is valid." She said she built the capsule to hold the document for 70 years. The paper is intact. The oilskin sealed it against moisture. She built the cavity at the right depth and angle to prevent thermal expansion damage. This woman thought about everything. He said she was an engineer. She said yes. The third page was the operative language. The trust established that the land described on the second page was held in perpetuity for a stated purpose. The language was plain, not legalistic in the way that obscured meaning, but precise in the way that prevented misreading. The purpose was stated in one sentence. This land is held in perpetuity for the benefit of women who come to it with nothing. That was all. No further qualification, no income threshold, no prior application, no review process, no committee or board to determine eligibility. The sentence said what it said and nothing else. She had arrived with $11.61. She had arrived with a worn pack and a boot whose left sole was reconsidering its commitments. She had arrived with nothing in the way that mattered, which was the way you had nothing when the world had made clear it did not intend to provide what a person needed to live, and you had internalized this so thoroughly that even when you had money, it did not feel like enough, because enough had never been available long enough for you to trust the concept. She met that standard. The fourth page was the maintenance clause. Whoever benefited from the trust was expected to maintain the property in good faith, specific enough to require action, vague enough to allow for what maintenance meant across decades and conditions. He read over her shoulder without being asked. She let him. She said the fifth page. He said, "What about it?" She said, "It's different paper." The fifth page was inside the oilskin, folded separately from the legal document, tucked against the back of the fourth page in a way that she might have missed if she had not been holding the oilskin at the angle where the edge of the extra fold was visible. She unfolded it. Not legal language. She knew that immediately. The same hand, the same ink, but the pressure was different, softer, the way you wrote when you were not being precise but being true, which was a different thing. He said, "What is it?" She said, "A letter." She read it silently first. He waited. She was not sure she had ever had an adult wait for her before, without prompting, without hurrying, without the impatience of a person whose time was more valuable than her process. He just waited. She finished reading. She held the paper for a moment. She said, "I'm going to read this out loud." He said, "All right." She read it. "I don't know your name. I don't know what brought you here. I don't know the year or the season or what the mountain looked like when you climbed it. I don't know what you left behind or what left you, but I know this: you went all the way in. You found the hatch and you came down and you read the journals and you went up the passage and through the dome and you found the capsule in the east wall. You did not stop at the first room. That is not what desperate people do. Desperate people stop when they find shelter. They stop when they find warmth. They stop when they find enough. You kept going. That means something. I have thought about what to call it, and I have not found the right word. Determined is part of it. Curious is part of it. Something that does not stop at enough because it has learned through experience that enough is a temporary condition, and so it keeps moving past enough towards something it does not yet have a name for. I built this for that part of you, not only for the desperation, though I understand it, and I built for that too. I mean the part that kept going past the first room, past the second, up the passage, into the dome. I built the dome for you. I set the glass panels at the angles I spent 3 winters calculating for you. I planted the apple tree for you. I did not know you would be the one to come. I did not know your face or your age or the shape of the trouble that brought you here, but I knew you would come. I always knew. Because I am an engineer and I understand load. I understand that the world puts weight on certain kinds of people in a concentrated way. Those people need somewhere the load can be set down for a while. They need a place that was built correctly, that will hold. This is that place. I am sorry I cannot be here to meet you. I would have liked to. I think I would have recognized you. Everything here is yours, not as ownership, which is a legal category, as belonging, which is a condition of the heart. I hope you find the document in the cornerstone. It will give you the first, but the second was always already yours. The moment you came through the hatch, you went all the way in. That tells me everything I needed to know. Welcome home. Clem Cade, 1953. She stopped reading. The room was very quiet. The stove ticked, the way iron ticked when it held heat. The lamp burned without drama. Outside, through the ventilation seam, the mountain was doing what mountains did in late October afternoons, which was nothing in particular and everything at once. He did not say anything for a long time. She did not need him to. She folded the letter carefully along the original creases, the way you refolded something that had waited 70 years and deserved to be returned to its shape correctly. He said, "She wrote that in 1953. She said, yes. He said, you were not born yet. She said, by about 40 years. He said she wrote for someone who did not exist yet. She said she knew they would. He was quiet again. He said, that's what I couldn't do. She looked at him. He said, when I was designing structures, I was always building for the people who would use them. I thought I understood what that meant. I had models and load calculations and safety margins. He was looking at his right hand, at the scar. He said, except I missed something, and the wall came down. And after that, I couldn't build for anyone because I had stopped trusting that what I built would hold. He looked at the walls. He said Clem built for someone she had never met and would never meet, and what she built held for 70 years. He was quiet. I've been coming here for 8 years to be near the fact that it was possible, to be near the evidence that someone got it right. She said, you can go all the way in now. He looked at her. She said, you don't have to stand at the entrance anymore. She said it without softness, but also without cruelty. Just the fact of it. You've been maintaining the lamp for 8 years. You can go the rest of the way. He did not answer, but he did not disagree. She gave him space to sit with it. She said, we need to do something about the county survey. He said, yes. She said, The trust document gives us standing to request a heritage review. The agricultural use is continuous and documented. The terraced benches have been in production for over 70 years. He said, I know the county planning office. I've been in their records for years. She said, can you make the case? He said, with that document, yes. Without it, I had a reference to a filing that no longer existed. With the original, I have the filing itself. She said, tomorrow. He said, tomorrow. They went down together the next morning, through the hatch and down the slope and over the bridge, Vesper crossing, first Corbin, following with the careful placement of feet she recognized as someone who had crossed this bridge hundreds of times in all conditions. On the far side, he had a truck parked at the head of a logging road she had not found in her initial approach. Old, well-maintained the truck of someone who understood that tools lasted as long as you took care of them. The county planning office was in a low building at the edge of the main administrative complex. She had been in enough county offices to know how they felt. The institutional patience of people who dealt with problems by category, and the patience wore thin at different speeds depending on which category your problem fell into. Corbin knew the planning coordinator. 8 years of showing up with questions about the ridge had produced a relationship of professional familiarity. They were seen within 20 minutes. The woman across the desk was in her 50s. She looked at the trust document with the attention of someone who had seen a lot of documents and could tell immediately whether a thing was real. She said, "Where did this come from?" Corbin said, "Original copy, preserved on site." She said, "The county has no record of this filing." Vesper said, "The 1967 flood." The woman looked at her, then back at the document. She said, "This is notarized. 1953. The notary is county of record at that time." Vesper said, "We're not here to litigate ownership. We're here to request a heritage review for the agricultural bench and the associated structures, continuous use since 1938, documentation going back to the founding year." She said, "What documentation?" Vesper said, "Journals, planting records, harvest records kept by successive users, 31 separate individuals who maintained the property over 80 plus years." She said, "That's an unusual history of use." Vesper said, "Yes." The woman looked at the document again. She said, "The trust language is clear about perpetual use for a stated purpose." Vesper said, "It is." She said, "If the trust is valid, the buffer zone designation would affect the current survey parameters." Corbin said, "Including the proposed rail corridor assessment." She looked at him. She said, "The trestle bridge is within the buffer zone." He said, "By the description on page 2, yes." She held the document for a moment, the kind of holding that was thinking and not just holding. She said, "I'll need to flag this for heritage review. That will pause the survey assessment until the review is completed." Vesper said, "How long?" She said, 60 to 90 days. Vesper said, "We'll take it." On the way back up the mountain, Corbin said, "You've done that before." Vesper said, "Done what?" He said, "Walked into an office and asked for exactly what you needed. Not what you wanted, not what you hoped for, what was actually available." She said, "Foster care teaches you to identify the decision maker in the room and ask for the thing they have authority to give." He said, "That's efficient." She said, "It's survival." He said, "Nothing for a section of the grade." He said, "I never learned to do that. I always tried to give them more than they asked for, more analysis, more detail, more assurance." She said, "Did it work?" He said, "Until it didn't." They climbed. At the bridge, he stopped and looked at the underside of the last section of decking. At the hatch, she now knew from both sides, at the bolted frame, at the precision of it. He said she used timber from trestle repair. The hatch frame is from the same stock as the bridge repair records from 1939. She said, "You researched the repair records." He said, "I researched everything." She said, "And you still didn't go past the first room." He said, "I didn't deserve to go past the first room." She looked at him. She said, "That's not how it works." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The letter doesn't say anything about deserving. The document doesn't say anything about deserving. You come with nothing and you go all the way in. That's the criterion." He said, "I'm not a woman who came with nothing." She said, "No, but she left those journals for a reason. She left the lamp to be lit for a reason. You've been doing that for 8 years. She said, "That's going all the way in by a different path." He held that. He crossed the bridge. They spent 4 days working together on the compound. Not by agreement exactly, by the logic of what needed doing and who was there to do it. Corbin knew the mountain. He had been living on its lower slopes for 8 years and had learned its drainage patterns and its frost lines and where the exposed stone held heat and where it let it go. Vesper knew the compound. She had been reading the journals and the founding entries, and she understood the system in a way that Corbin, who had never gone past the first room, could not have known. Together they were more useful than either was alone. He showed her how the upper terrace irrigation gate worked when the connecting line was partially blocked, which it was. He showed her where the cistern overflow had been redirected at some point in the 1980s by someone whose solution had held but could be improved. He showed her the section of the trail from the logging road that was starting to show erosion damage and how to address it with materials already present on the slope. She showed him the dome. He stood in it for a long time. She gave him the space he needed. She went to the far end and checked the growing frames and waited. When she looked back, he was standing at the base of the apple tree with one hand on the trunk, not examining it, just touching it. The way you touch something you had known was real for 8 years without having been able to touch it. He said, "The glass angles." She said, "What about them?" He said, "They're calculated for the winter solstice sun. The low December sun hits the panels at this angle and reflects off the dome ceiling in a way that distributes heat evenly across the floor." He was looking up at the panels. In summer, the high sun angle misses the panels almost entirely, so the dome doesn't overheat. He paused. "It's a passive solar calculation, precise enough that it only works for this latitude at this altitude." She said she spent 3 winters with a cold chisel getting it right. He said, "I know." He took his hand off the tree. "I read about it in the journal 8 years ago." She said, "But you didn't come see it." He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because if I came in here and it was right, it would mean the difference between what she built and what I built was something I had to explain." He was looking at the dome ceiling. "If I came in here and it was wrong, it would mean she was human too, and I could use that." He shook his head. "So I stayed outside, where I didn't have to know." She said, "And now you know." He said, "And now I know." She said, "What's the difference?" He thought about it. He said, "She wasn't just technically right. She was right about something underneath the technical. She understood why she was building this. Every calculation she made came from a reason that was larger than the calculation." He said, "I built structures because I was good at building structures. I was solving engineering problems because the problems were interesting." He paused. I wasn't building for anyone the way she was building for anyone. She said, the wall came down. He said, the wall came down, and I couldn't go back because there was nothing to go back to. He said, but she built for someone who didn't exist yet, and the building held, and you're here. He said it like a fact he was testing to see if it was real. She said, I'm here. He looked at her. He said the journal, the one she wrote about the dome. She said she thought this was why she was here. She came looking for drainage and she found a dome. And she said she thought that was where the light goes. He said, I've been thinking about that for 8 years. She said, what do you think it means? He said, I think she meant that there are things you find by looking for something else, and the things you find are more important than what you were looking for. He looked at the tree. He said, she came here to hide. That's what I thought for years. Engineer, unnamed, invisible in her own work, came to this mountain and built a hiding place. He said, but the dome isn't a hiding place. You don't put 18 glass panels in a dome you're hiding in. You put them there because you want the light to come in. She had not thought about it quite that way. He said she wasn't hiding. She was building somewhere she could be visible on her own terms. On the 5th day, he went back down to address his cabin situation. The county review would take 60 to 90 days, and he needed to be in contact with the process. He could come back in 2 weeks, possibly sooner. He said it practically, not as an ending. She said, the 3rd terrace needs the irrigation gate adjusted before the ground freezes. He said, I know how to do that. She said, I know you know, but I won't be able to reach it alone from the angle it needs. He said 2 weeks. She said 2 weeks. He climbed the shaft and crossed the bridge and went down the grade. She stood at the open hatch and listened to his footsteps until the pine absorbed them. Then she climbed back down. The compound was quiet, the quiet of a space that had held many people and many silences and had learned not to distinguish between them. She rebuilt the stove, she made tea, she sat on the cot with the lamp burning low beside her, and the 31 journals on the shelf, and the trust document and Clem's letter folded carefully beside her. She picked up her own notebook, the small spiral one, 8 pages left. She opened it to the first blank page. She held the pencil. She had been writing things worth remembering in this notebook for 2 years. Useful things, practical things, a phone number for a shelter 2 towns over that was better than average, the closing time of a food bank that was not posted online, the name of a supervisor at a warehouse who did not ask for a permanent address on the hiring form. This was different. This was not for future Vesper. This was for whoever came next. She wrote, Bridge 14, elevation 4190, arrived in October. Rain. Below that, the dome maintains growing conditions year-round through 18 glass panels installed at calculated angles by the original builder. The passive solar design distributes heat evenly in winter without any external power source. The root cellar holds temperature through natural drainage design alone. The cold storage passage has 3 distinct temperature zones based on distance from the stone face. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. Practical things, the kind Clem had started with, worth recording because they were worth knowing. She kept writing. There are 31 journals on the shelf before this one. I have read 4 of them. Each one is different. A visitor in 1943, 11 days midwinter. A woman in 1978, 7 months she planted the berry canes between the terraces. I don't know their names in the way names usually work, but I know who they were in the way this place knows people, which is by what they left and what they improved and what they wrote on the last page. She read back what she had written. Then she added one more paragraph. Clem Cade built this place alone between 1938 and 1954. She was a structural engineer who spent 23 years doing her work under other people's names because the world at that time was not prepared to acknowledge that she could do what she did. She came to this mountain and built something under her own name. Everything she designed still works exactly as she intended. Every joint, every lintel, every calculation about light and temperature and load. She left a letter for whoever came next. The letter says you went all the way in. That is the criterion. That is the whole thing. She stopped. She thought about what the last line should be. She thought about Clem writing to a person who did not exist yet, about the dome and the 18 glass panels and the apple tree whose late fruit hung on in October because someone had thought carefully about shelter, about 31 people who had come through this hatch with nothing and left something small and real and lasting. She thought about herself, Vesper Doll, 20 years old, $11.61, a boot whose left sole had finally given up and peeled away completely on the second terrace 2 days ago, which she had fixed with a strip of copper wire from the coil in the stone chamber, because there was always wire if you knew where to look. She wrote the last line. Whoever reads this after me, you went all the way in. That already tells me something important about you. She closed the notebook. She set it on the shelf, not at the end of the row, at the beginning of the space that was not yet filled. The 30-second journal holding space for the 32nd, which was not yet done, not by a long way. Outside, through the ventilation seam, the mountain was going dark. The October night was coming down from the peak, the way cold came on mountains, patient and certain, and without opinion. The lamp burned. The stove held its warmth. In the dome above the apple tree stood in the dark, its few late fruits holding on through the night, the way they held through every night, not because they were told to, but because the conditions were right, because someone had thought carefully about what they needed and had built those conditions one season at a time, over 16 years for a person they did not know yet. The lamp burned. Vesper stayed.